Next up, we have Vern from Chromatic. Bringing him up. Awesome. Vern, welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, sure. Without further ado, I will add your screen and get out of the way.
Perfect. Thank you. Hey, everyone. My name is Varun. I'm part of the developer experience team at Chromatic, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. It's Chromatic. It is a tool for reviewing and testing UIs. And in particular, what's sort of unique about Chromatic is that it focuses on component-based tests. And then also, these tests are actually powered by Storybook stories. And that's kind of a really unique workflow that Chromatic has. In fact, Chromatic is built by the maintainers of Storybook, so the two tools kind of work really, really seamlessly. And I should probably take a step back and actually start by talking about Storybook a little bit, and then dive into sort of how that fits into the larger picture with Chromatic. So when you're working on an application, you're building out that app using multiple components, and those components tend to usually have multiple states. So here I have an example of a restaurant card from a food delivery application. The card looks different depending on the application state. So there's a default mode, when a restaurant is newly added to the system, for example, or if it's closed for the day, or when the page is loading, the card kind of looks slightly different and behaves slightly different in each case. And then you might have variations that come from different color modes that you support, localization, or viewport sizes. So these are all the different variations of that one particular component that you're building out. The thing is, when you're working on this component in your application, you have to be able to replicate all of those different scenarios and view the component in all those different states. And there is a bit of a sort of friction that gets introduced when you try to do that in an application. And that's because the component is connected to actual application state, backend data that might be being fetched from your services and so on. So if you want to trigger a particular state for that component, quite often you have to actually jump into the code and add manual overrides to the code temporarily to trigger a particular state. For example, if I want to see the closed state of that component, I'll go in and manually add the is closed prop to my component. Similarly, if I want to trigger the loading state, I might add a is loading state to the component. And this is a pretty common scenario. This is a relatively straightforward component where I can simply override props to trigger different states. For more complex components, you have to rely on browser dev tools or the network tab to trigger loading states and network failure states. And it gets kind of tedious. And also, it's wasteful work. So you do that once when you're working on that component, then you come back to it 6 months later, or another teammate comes back to work on that component or to fix a bug, and they have to repeat that work all over again. So all that work you did to sort of simulate the different variations of the component, that gets lost. And Storybook was built precisely to tackle that workflow, to simplify that workflow, and to take away some of that sort of tedious work that you have to do repeatedly. And the way Storybook works is it detaches the component from the application and gives you a sandbox where you can run that component in isolation. And once you've isolated that component, you can actually simulate all the different variations relatively straightforward. And Storybook gives you all the mechanisms that are required to simulate all the variations of a component. And the way that works is using something called a story. A story is essentially all the inputs that are required to render a particular state for a component. For example, this is the default state for that restaurant card component that I showed, and args are all of the props that go into that component that render that particular state. So you follow this process to write out stories for all of the other states of that component, and you save all of these stories in a stories file that sits alongside your component code and gets tracked and version controlled just like any other test would be. And then the idea is, during development, Storybook is running all of these different stories for you. So when you're working on a component, you can quickly cycle through all the different variations to see what they look like, and verify that they look and behave the way you want them to. And then for stories, it's not just about sort of args or props that are going into the component. You can simulate different themes, different locales, any other sort of global context that impacts how the UI is rendered. You can even mock API requests that the component might be triggering within the component to ensure that any data, any kind of information that's required to render a particular state gets captured in the story itself. So effectively, with stories, you have all of the test cases for what a component does. And that's really cool. Effectively, each story is one scenario or one test case for a component. And because we have all the test cases, we just need a test runner. And that's what Chromatic is. Chromatic takes all of those stories and converts them into UI tests that are executed in a cloud in our cloud-based browser infrastructure. It runs a few different types of tests. The first one is visual regression testing. The idea here is you want to catch any kind of accidental changes to the UI, things that are unintentional, a bit of leaky CSS, or you try to change the layout on one component, but it breaks up a different layout on a different page. So visual regression tests are fantastic for capturing that. And the way Chromatic works is once you have your stories, it uploads all of your stories into the cloud infrastructure, runs them all in parallel, and then captures a snapshot of each story. And if it happens to find any visual differences between the previous version of the snapshot and the newly captured snapshot, it alerts you to those changes. So you can go in and see whether that's an accidental change or an intentional change. If it's an accidental change, that's a good trigger for you to go back to your code and see if you need to go fix something. And if it's an intentional change, you can approve that and update the baseline. So that will be the new state of that particular story and that particular component. So visual testing is one aspect of testing. The other aspect is testing how the component actually behaves, the underlying logic, the user interactions. Classically, when you test something like this, you either go with really sort of heavy end-to-end tests, which tend to be flaky, or the more popular approach these days is to use integration tests that run at the component level, using tools like Jest and testing library. So that's exactly the workflow that Storybook gives you. But the cool thing is it builds on that idea of stories, and it runs those tests in the browser itself. So the way this works is you can attach something called a play function to your story. And this play function is a snippet of code that gets executed once the story has rendered. So within this play function, you can actually write out user interactions and even run assertions. And the cool thing is, instead of reinventing the wheel, we're taking sort of the best of the ecosystem. So you're using Jest and testing library, the same familiar, really nice developer API, sort of API that you're familiar with, except you get to write that right inside the story file itself. So the story becomes the starting point, and then the play function has the interactions and assertions on top of it. And then the cool thing is, during development, when you're running Storybook locally, those tests are running in the browser, so you can debug them relatively straightforwardly. And then once you're ready to open up a pull request, you trigger a Chromatic build, and Chromatic will actually run both the visual test, but then it also waits for the interactions to complete and ensures that all the assertions are passing, and then captures the snapshot. So you're able to combine both visual and interaction testing into one test. So it works really great for catching any accidental changes to the UI, but also you get to verify that the underlying logic is working as you would expect it to. So really what it boils down to is you build components in Storybook, and during the development process, you write stories, and effectively, as you're writing stories, it simplifies your development workflow, but also you're capturing all the different test cases for the UI. And then Chromatic uses those stories to power tests, so you're able to test both how the UI looks and functions simultaneously. And then Redwood actually has really fantastic built-in support for Storybook. So if you all are interested, you can get going really quickly. I encourage you to give it a try. You can learn more at chromatic.com. Thank you.
This is so great. As a front-end developer and someone that focuses a lot on design, I have so much appreciation for Storybook and Chromatic. I think probably my favorite use case is I've been on projects where I'm having to build a front end for a back-end developer, and I've had to create a fake page for them because Storybook wasn't on the project, and then write in documentation, once this has been implemented, please delete this fake page. So awesome. Let me bring up our panelists. Keith, let's hear from you.
I have become a Storybook believer. I'm a fan. One, the Redwood tutorial has a storybook chunk. That was my first introduction. And then two, I'm working through the Learn with Redwood course that Amy has produced. And Amy, you set a good example of using Storybook to define an efficient flow. And so I'm there. It took a leap to get over this, oh wow, another tool I gotta get my hands around. But I'm there and I'm digging it. And so now I'm thinking, all right, when do I make the leap to Chromatic? Not just Storybook, but Storybook with Chromatic.
That was as good a time as any.
Right.
Keith, I've been impressed with how easy it is to integrate. There's just a single command, and basically that will publish your entire Storybook library to Chromatic, and visual integration tests are automatically built into that. I did not know about interaction tests, so that's awesome. I'm excited to check that piece out.
Cool.
Jayesh, what about you?
Yeah, Varun, a great presentation. I had a quick question. So Chromatic is acting as a test runner. I'm guessing somewhere you are loading this into a browser, maybe headless or in your cloud and running it. Do you support running it across multiple browser versions, or for companies that may have to handle bigger builds or wider compatibility or stuff like that? How do you?
Yeah, totally. So we do support multiple browsers, so you can run your tests in parallel across Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Edge. And you can even control sort of if you want to run your test across multiple viewports. So test for responsive sizing, that's built into it too. So yeah, definitely both are covered.
And it's all configurable and it's all configuration driven.
Yeah, so
or
we don't.
Driven, like just.
It is code driven, so we don't allow you to specify a particular browser version. We tend to keep up to date with whatever is latest. So you get to test in the latest versions of the browsers.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Yoko?
Yeah, I think Vern Chromatic kind of made it seem so easy to test these out. And I think most of us here have tried testing at-scale UI components without any tooling, and it was a mess. So this is super cool. I thought it's worth mentioning that for anyone who kind of work in a bigger team who actually have a design system, like you have a different team designing, oh, here's a hierarchy, here's how you use it. Storybook and Chromatic is super useful.
Yep, 100%. Awesome. Well, thank you, Vern, for participating in our partner pitches, and really just appreciate you being part of the Redwood community, and not just a part of it, like a huge part of it. The fact that you can just, as you mentioned, run a single command and be up and running with Storybook is fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, sure.
Wait a minute.